It's good to see people here again as in yesterday. It's a more intimate group. I had a great opportunity yesterday to tell you a lot about what I think about the way the world is changing, what I think is important to know. Hopefully you'll be able to find the presentation online. I'm putting it there. I know there'll be video as well. So it was a lot of me talking to you. One of the things, though, that I think is very important in this space and in the dynamic that I tried to describe in the world is that we now have a lot of experience of people talking to each other, right? It's a two-way conversation. And I'm 100% convinced that all of you together are smarter than me, and that you know many things about how data journalism, and open data, the tension in this space is being experienced in Argentina and Latin America, around the world, in your own work than I do. So I didn't want to come here again for a second day and tell you just what I think you should know. I thought it would be more useful if you asked me questions about what you wanted to know about, based upon what you heard yesterday, if you'd read the paper, what you had questions about there, or if you had other concerns or thoughts about the space. I'd do the best I could to answer them, and if I didn't have answers, maybe all of you would as well. In my experience in the last 5 years, some of the best conferences and the best parts of conferences I've been to have been unconferences. They have been ones where the people drive the conversation, where the people determine the topics, where the people ask the questions. It's not just one person saying, this is how it is. I did spend years doing research on this space. Like, I had something to say which is based upon evidence, talking to hundreds and hundreds of people. But I don't think it's the last word. So that's where we start. Do you have questions? I'll do my best to answer.
I have one. May I start? Well, my first question is regarding your yesterday's presentation of other devices or places where we can find open data. You mentioned SMS, email, or that we should add-ons, that we should start to think out of the box on like web or applications. So maybe if you can give us an example of that, I would love to.
So make sure I understand this. You're asking for other places to use open data or places to find it?
No, yesterday then you talked me about the add-on for Firefox, but I want to share all of that with the others. So that, do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah, so
I think I understand. One of the things that's useful to talk about with open data, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're a civic hacker, whether you're a journalist, whether maybe you're all three of those things, crossover, is that in many cases people won't find your data, right? They won't want to come and look through the catalog. We need to make sure that it's available for them, for the scientists, the researchers, the people who know how to do analytics, who want to see the data itself. And I think it's important to give them the idea of how the work was done, right? The methodology by which you arrived at the visualization, how the application works. But for many consumers, they simply won't do that. So how do we get the data to have the most utility to the world? One way to do that is to build it into existing applications and services to help data find the people. She asked a question about other places to do that. One option is to let people query it using short message sending, text messages, to use gateways built by companies like Twilio or other forums to let people query a database so that they can do it using a feature phone, not a smartphone. Another is to create a plug-in for a browser, web browser, so that when you are viewing something, it automatically has the data integrated into whatever it is they're searching for. Just saw an example of this in the United States using recalls data. We have several different agencies that are in charge of issuing recalls. One is the Food and Drug Administration. Another is a Consumer Product Safety Commission. Both of them, because of the efforts of the administration to go approach open data and to create APIs, application programming interfaces, have made it easier to get that data and integrate it into other places. So the idea is, can you make a web browser for when you're looking at a product, you can automatically see if there are recalls that exist for it, to make that part of people's experience. And then, of course, there are traditional applications and services, search engines that build in those kinds of data. So there's lots of ways to do it that don't just end up in an app. Is that
Okay, thank you.
okay? Great. Another question? Please.
I want to know if there is some tool that let me to search a set of sites, defined set of sites, and defined range of data, and the undefined set of words or expressions. Only this. Lo cual
I think I understand. So you're looking for a search engine for data.
will be very easy to get the information.
Well, there are two directions to go in. One is to use advanced search operators for Google. Google crawls everything it can crawl. Doesn't get into the dark web or the deep web as much. But if you used the advanced search strings, there are different functions or operators you can put into there which will enable you to find things. And what's interesting is that this is actually something with great journalistic opportunities, to go beyond basic search into advanced search. And we know this because there was just an enforcement action under the Federal Communications Commission back in the States, where journalists found a data breach because of data that was in search results. There was basically a hole in the site that enabled things to be available. So Google is the first thing I would say. Use tutorials on Google to be able to put in different operators. The second is new startups that are focusing upon trying to make the data more accessible across many different silos. One of the most promising is one called enigma.io, enigma.io. And I think I put them on screen yesterday. That's a pretty good place to go for data discovery. Enigma, yes, I-O, yep. And then the third is, of course, investigative journalists organizations. They are, in many cases, creating data catalogs that might be relevant as well. I know that there are lots of different versions of them, and they're all country-specific, but they often know exactly where the domain knowledge is and will be able to have a catalog to search through. So that's a good start. Another question? Okay. Another question? Thank you, and thank you. I wish my Spanish were better. I really do. So disculpe. This is one of the hardest questions I think journalists face right now, in terms of thinking of how we use data in our stories. And this is one of the hardest questions we face as citizens as well, because journalists are often both. And the short answer is that as much of your data is available, can and will be used, right? We know that. We know that because there are many different places where, in aggregate, it's extremely useful to different places. And this is the big challenge that we face as societies and people who think about these things, is that in aggregate, million people, 5 million people, 10 million people's data can be used to analyze, to find things that can help them if it's their health data. We can see where these things have epidemiological applications, public health. We can see how they have applications for cancer. We can see it has applications for every single ailment or disease or disorder. When you have all of that data, you can start to find patterns, which is the same thing that Steve just presented upon, this idea that you can find the trends and then go investigate those trends. The challenge is that when you're an individual represented in all that data, how it may be used to make decisions about you and to potentially discriminate about you, even if you haven't done anything. And so there are choices that we are all making to have our data be more shareable or not. And there are choices that are being imposed upon us around the collection of the data, whether we want it to be or not. And this is where actually media has a really important role to play, which is simply to report that collection is happening and to report upon what's happening because of the collection and the use. That the reporting needs to be good enough so that the people know this is happening. And so the government knows that it's happening too, because the officials are reading the same news reports you are. We're all finding them all of these things together. It's not like they have, in many cases, some magical knowledge of things that we don't. Some of them are ahead in certain places, but in many cases not. So when we talk about open data from government, it's actually much more simple than open government about people, because it's their personal data. And in countries that don't have really strong privacy laws, there's a real challenge here, because there's no regulatory reason not to share that data or to use it. There's no rules to say that you can collect it and you have to protect it a certain way. So even if you're a good, responsible steward, someone else can't breach it and then sell it on a dark market. People who've reported upon crime know that online there are marketplaces where people's personal data is bought and sold. And it's a little sad. It's worth very little money. You know.
One example you presented yesterday was really caught my attention with the personal names of the account holders in New York. The thing is, yeah, you can get really upset about it and say, well, I don't want my name there, but the thing is, it's there. You may choose not to see it, you may choose to believe that if you say, I don't want it there, nobody can reach it, but they can. Yeah. So what really bugs me doesn't annoy me, it kind of worries me a bit, is that I know less about me than the government and companies and that anybody that tries to learn. So
Yeah.
what I would really like, again, is maybe there's something I actually don't know about, but it's a kind of me crawler. Say, I'm Gonzalo Barrera, this is my social security number, find me.
Yep.
Tell me, what does the internet know about me? Because I want to know, at least have this much control. That I can do, let me do it.
So there are firms which specialize in reputation management. And sometimes they are hired by people who are going to be undergoing scrutiny for a job, for confirmation hearing, for school. Many young people know now not to upload pictures of themselves doing illegal things onto Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. They're learning that Snapchat may not be safe either, despite the claims of the companies. But what we don't have control over is what other people say about us. This is the big challenge. Europe has decided to take an interesting approach to this. The court has said that there is a right to be forgotten. It's an interesting idea. Journalists do not like this very much. A right to be forgotten. So there's a European court which has said that European citizens have the right to ask Google to take links out of the search engine, not the publisher, but to take links so it's no longer searchable about themselves. If it defames them, if it makes them look bad, if it's inaccurate. And of course, we can predict what's going to happen. People who are the subject of corruption cases, of libel cases, or who have been involved in very embarrassing things want the embarrassing thing removed.
But here also the court ruled the issue. And the search, I'm not responsible for the result.
I don't think that the Google has to take down links yet in Argentina.
But there is the lawmakers want to pass a law.
Right.
Now, it's very new.
So this is a useful thing to bring up. And this is why it's useful to talk about this not as a technology issue, not as a data issue, right? This is about the kind of society we want to live in and the kind of rules you want to live by. And we all know if you want changes, you have to advocate to the legislatures and say that we want things to be different and we want certain kinds of rules to exist, whether it's freedom of information from the government or whether it's access to your data from companies that collect it about you. In my country, we're having a little bit of a discussion about data brokers right now. Some of them are trying to get out ahead. There's one called Axiom, where you can log on online and see the data they have about you. And you can ask them to fix it. Now, this is an interesting thing. Two minds about this. One, this is like credit reports. People know what credit reports are here too, yeah? These are the things that when you apply for credit, they go check and see what your record is. Data brokers have everything else. Not just your record with money, but with your records with banks, with real estate, hospitals, education, driving records, what you own, magazines you read, portfolio about you, the same kinds of things that campaigns want to know so they can target you with ads. In the US, this is very aggressive. The ads are now following us around on our phones, on the screens, trying to get us to change our vote, or to vote, period. But we have a right, because there's a Fair Credit Reporting Act in the States, to say I can get my credit report once a year from each one of the credit bureaus. What we don't have yet is a right to get our data broker report from the data brokers. Now, Axiom has done an interesting thing. They've chosen to give that access for free, and they've said, come fix it. On the one hand, okay, you can see what they have. You could fix it, or you could do what some people who are a little more paranoid do and break it. I know people who've done that, who've gone on there and intentionally said, okay, they're wrong, or made it wronger, because they want it to be wronger about them, to try to mess with it. In the end, it's just one, though, of many brokers. So the question you're asking gets at something that we're kind of understanding, is that there are many different entities collecting data about us. Often there are rules that government can't collect it, but they can go to another third party that does and get their data. In the US, we have a challenge around license plate readers. There are now cameras all around the country which take pictures of license plates, and those can be used to track your movements. Very useful if you're trying to track down people with warrants, right? But you can see how that could be abused. So we have to think about what the rules we think should be and advocate for those rules to be passed if we want them to protect consumers.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
I just want to say something, because that's exactly the thing. Maybe I'm a bit cynical, but what you're saying is right. We can pass laws, we can try this, but in the end, if somebody else wants to break it, they can do it. And after all, it's really, really hard to prosecute these crimes. So,
Okay.
maybe I
So
have an attitude that
it's fine to be cynical. Yeah, it's fine to be cynical, and there's nothing wrong with that. On the other hand, I will say that it's worth passing the laws, and it's worth passing laws to create a strong consumer protection agency. We have one in the US. It's called the Federal Trade Commission. I know people at Google, Facebook, and Twitter who all have to deal with the fact that because they made mistakes around the data of their users, they're under 20-year observation from that agency. 20 years, where they do audits of whether they're living up to the attestations they've made about the security and privacy of their users. And our Congress, 100 years ago, created the FTC at a time when the United States had more corporate power consolidated into the smallest number of people you can think of. During the summers, 90% of the wealth of the US would go up to this little town in Maine, where my family, visits for vacation, and go around in their big boats. It was called the Gilded Age. And there was a name for these very powerful people. It was called the robber barons. And at the time, there were some very powerful forces that didn't want them to be constrained. But there was so much popular upset about labor conditions, about environmental conditions, about corruption, that the Congress passed a law which changed the game. They created the Federal Trade Commission and empowered it to prosecute companies. And if they repeatedly abused people, to make them not only culpable from money with huge fines, but to eventually potentially close them. And you can see their consumer actions online. They have real power. Ultimately, government is about us. It's about protecting us. In many cases, young people all around the world hate government. They view it as this other thing, but it's not. It's us. If we want it to protect us, we can ask that laws and agencies be created that then act. And if you can document abuses of consumers, discrimination against people on the basis of their sex or gender or whatever else, what investigative journalism is supposed to do, muckrakers did that a century ago, driving change, which led to these laws being created, then you can see social change as a result. It's easy to be cynical about this. So I want to take another question. I'll keep, yeah. So there are young people all over the world with different cultures, with different educations, with different perspectives, with different feelings about what kinds of things should be shared, about whom, between different people. And I think that their expectations will range on a gradient depending upon their experience with governments. If your country has only had a government which is a security state and only protects the powerful and is very corrupt, your expectation that government is ever going to take care of you is probably pretty low. In my country, I'm expecting record low participation rates in the vote there that's going to happen in our midterm elections on Tuesday. I expect very few people will vote because what they're hearing about isn't addressing what they care about from the politicians. Their unemployment rate is twice as high as the national average. Collectively, they have $1 trillion in consumer debt, not consumer debt, excuse me, in student loan debt, which is worse, you can't get rid of it. $1 trillion US on the backs of these young people. This is a really tough combination. And there's no obvious way up the ladder. Internships are unpaid. Politicians are focused clearly upon other constituencies. Corporations are paying them as little as they can. This is a toxic combination. And media, unfortunately, is contributing to this because they can see the polarization And they're also reporting on everything government does wrong. So they're being reminded constantly of all the mistakes and not so frequently where things go right. It's a hard thing. I do think that there is a generational difference in terms of the outlook that I have as a child of the 80s versus a young person who grew up during a decade of war, during a decade in which we've seen surveillance grow much higher, we've seen income stagnate. We can see how the data is affecting all of us. Ultimately, I think to have any kind of trust be rebuilt, you need to see institutions be reformed, to see the problems that get documented in the front pages by investigations result in change. In this country, I would be pretty cynical too if I saw La Nación report upon politicians and then the politicians stay in power, right? Do you believe that, you know, your vote matters if you see that nothing changes? You have to see shifts in the world. You know, you have to see that if corporations abuse their users, if researchers do unethical experiments upon people, if corporations degrade the environment, there's someone who then takes care of that. Ultimately, journalism tells us about these things, but it's the people that have to change it. I'd like to believe that young people are the answer to that. I always do, because we have to hope that. I don't think it's my parents. My parents are the ones who botched it. My grandparents did a good job. My grandparents are the one who served in World War II, who came back, who went to college, who built the institutions. They're an amazing generation. My parents, my generation, the ones who are coming up now in these new roles, who came up in the darkness of the 80s, maybe we do better. I'm hopeful. I'm trying, you know. But, you know, you have to give the young people the ability to get out from underneath the debt and to give them some reasons to be hopeful the institutions can respond to their upset. If that happens, maybe the trust comes up. If it doesn't, well. Other question?
A question there?
She had a question. We'll take one right here. Someone else can jump in and then, you know, keep it going.
That would be good. Actually, it's because it's about what he was talking, and also suddenly you talked about the media and how the media says what the governments do wrong and never what they do right. Well, I think journalism is there to question authority and power. If we're going to write about, of course, you can always have page 15 a beautiful, nice story about like the new school or the playground. But that's not what should be on the front page of national newspapers or of, you know, television networks. We are there. We are the journalists, and our job is to question authority and power and see whether they're doing things right. And when he was talking, we were talking about trust and how government is used in America. I was also thinking how unfair that would be here. Here it's like the other way around. Argentina has the strongest surveillance program on their own citizens than any other place in the world. Every Argentine person has had their faces scanned. So when you go to a demonstration or you do anything, they have you on record. There's nothing that we can now do to, you know, try and have a more confidential life. So what he was talking about before and how he's concerned about what data about us is on the internet available. I think it also with countries like the US or European countries are in a much more advanced stage. Their citizens are more aware. We are not aware. So I think although it's difficult, it would be quite interesting to see whether the world could come together, you know, people like yourself or experts of surveillance and privacy, web, etc., come together and see what's going on and where all the differences are. Because otherwise, you know, it's all right for America to think, you know, the government
Well, it hasn't always. I mean, we have many examples in our country where it hasn't. So this was more of a statement than a question then.
No, it was more like, you know, would it be possible or realistic to have, you know, people who are concerned in every country in the world come together and discuss these issues?
Yeah.
Or is it, or would that not be possible because
Well,
legals?
what's the alternative, though? That some external country comes in and tells you how to run your government? We've tried that. Right? I've seen what happens when our diplomats say anything.
No governments.
Right?
Talking about, you know, experts, people who are, you know,
Come on. Let's be real here, right? But like, I mean, how is power actually exercised in the world? It's not from people like me. It's not from an NGO saying it or not. It's from people who have actual leverage with the government, right? Those who control its debt, which is the point of contention, right? Those who control contracts, those who control its rights on an international stage, people with guns or bigger bombs or ships, you know, who say you do this or something else happens. The ultimate thing that I think is important to talk about is why change happens in any society. I have a default belief in democracy and democratic change and in self-determination. I think ultimately the people who live in a country should be the ones who get to say how it should be ruled. That's right.
was aiming at, not
Right.
government and policymakers,
Yeah.
but, you know, try and make citizens aware of what's going on. Because I think that people, normal, regular people who are not in power,
Right. So, but,
don't really know.
so that's what journalism should do, right? We can agree on that. The journalism should, at its best, inform people, right? That's what the public interest is, that we're saying, standing up to people in power and saying, we're going to publish what you're really doing so everyone knows, and then they can advocate for reforms. If enough people get upset and sustain that upset, then the politicians put in reforms which create institutions, which reform institutions, which put in laws which create access to information, which do the things that lead to a more just society. But it's all slow, and it goes backwards and forwards. I mean, there's progress, there's regression. Some administrations are good, some are terrible. Sometimes there are people in government who want to do the right thing, but are hindered by corruption, by inefficiency, by bad decisions around technologies. You know, all of these things matter. Ultimately, I don't think any country, though, is going to be able to move forward with a feeling of just government unless the people are behind it on some level. If the question, though, is about what the role of journalism is, I would expand it a little bit beyond the one you said, right? I do think it's responsible for journalists to also document when things have been done right? To put that into places where people will be aware of it, so then they can say, do more of that. So they can say, see how that city or that province or that country did it? We want a law like that. We want a governor like that. We want an agency like that. We want to have the same kind of services they do. That's also the role of the journalist. It's not, right, it's not just to say they're all corrupt, vote them out. It can't be. Otherwise, we just get into the vicious cycle of pulling people out, and that's so good. So, another question? Un momento.
The presentation yesterday and today as well. And I was expecting some comment about the activities of the NCA in the United States, and the largest security agency in the US that has the highest ability to collect data together with Google and Facebook. Remember that they plugged in the fiber optics cable that were not encrypted, and they obtained all the information, and we know that thanks to Snowden. And there was not mention to this issue these days. Apparently there's nothing to be said about that. And the second question is, Glenn Greenwald, the reporter that worked actively with Snowden to find out about this. Now he says that he's going to create a new media with Jay Bezos, that is the owner of Amazon. So I would like to know what you think about that,
Okay.
whether this is going to be a new direction in journalism in the US.
So I'll answer the second question first. As far as I know, Glenn Greenwald is working with Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay, and has no relationship with Jeff Bezos, who purchased the Washington Post. First Look Media is the name of this company. It's in the headlines right now because Matt Taibbi, a Rolling Stone reporter who was going to open up a new publication under First Look Media, left. And there's a big insidery discussion about why and what happened. And now there's a question about what will happen next with his publication. And people are questioning what will happen next for First Look Media. Well, it looks like the people at The Intercept, which is the publication Greenwald works for, have gotten sufficient editorial independence and budget that they'll be able to continue doing what they do. Many people who are interested in the space are curious to see what it is they do when they're done with reporting on the Snowden documents. Which leads me to the first question. It's true that I didn't say NSA yesterday. It's also true that I emphasized how important it was to be focused upon protecting your data, to know about privacy, to know about encryption, to know about security, to know that if you're treating data as a source, you need to protect it like you protect your human sources. That the move to digital spaces in data journalism creates new challenges. So it's true, I didn't say NSA, but they were present throughout the discussion as a very powerful entity. I think it's a given that we are going to be faced with powerful spy agencies throughout the rest of our lifetimes. It's because we as citizens expect our national governments to protect us. The question is what the rules are for them to operate. Just as we have questions about when it's okay to break into a journalist's home, when is it okay to break into their computer? Just as we have questions about when is it okay to open someone's mail? When is it okay to read someone's email? Just as we have questions about when it is all right to arrest someone with a warrant or without. These are questions that are not about technology. They're about the existing ethics and boundaries that guide us as a society. And in many cases, law enforcement has used the excuses of technology because it's new to say that the old rules don't apply. And now we're coming around to a conversation saying, you know what, actually, get a warrant before you come into my house. Get a warrant before you open my email. Get a warrant before you look in my online drive. Journalists in the US have to know that email that exists in the cloud is not protected in the same way email is on their server at home. Different laws govern these things. That if a New York Times journalist uses Gmail, there could be a back-end tap on it that isn't protected in the same way that a New York Times address is. This is actually a big problem because I know a lot of reporters who just forward their email, who should know better. But this goes to our digital literacy, right? Our data literacy. I do see a significant behavior shift because of the reporting of Greenwald, because of the disclosures of Snowden, where Apple and Google are encrypting phones in a way that's really ticked off law enforcement, right? They're too hard to get into. I see a shift in journalists encrypting their email because they want to have that be protected. And the good news about that is that before, if you encrypted your email, you became a person of interest, right? There were so few people who did it. Now, the more people who do it, the more there's herd immunity, just like you get from vaccines. So there's some positive changes from these things.
Because you also mentioned the trends. And in fact, the trend is that the internet started by being an anonymous, a free place, initially operated by scientists and a community that wanted to disseminate. And that came down to the economic interest later on. And so the trend during the Iraq war is laws of exception in the US that say that the government has rights over the privacy of people and the people have nothing to say about that. So this is my feeling about what's going on in the US now and the transformation that you are going through, that internet is going through. In terms of trends, I think that what is happening is just the opposite. And at citizen level, there's not much to be done, except as what you mentioned, no? With dramatic changes by the population.
So this is a fun thing. I got to go to Brazil last week, talk to journalism conferences, and the students wanted to talk to me about the US and Snowden too. It seems like wherever I go, this happens. And last decade, I got to travel, and people wanted to talk to me about Iraq and President Bush. So this, I guess, is the fate of Americans abroad. We talk about the choices of our government, and we get in trouble if we talk about the choices of yours. So let's say this. Yes, the internet began in one way, but we shouldn't misrepresent what it was. The researchers knew who they were talking to because there were so few people on there. They knew who was at that IP address. There's a pretty robust discussion, by the way, about whether an IP address, an internet protocol address, is private information or not, right? Is something you should be protected against if it's something that does identify you. We know if you log on using different addresses over locations, that can be used to track you, track a source, right? If you're making a request for data from government, you could ask for IP address locations. Whoa. Might be able to find interesting things about public officials and where they logged on and where they weren't logged on. If we talk about the kind of choices we want to exist, though, in this space, which is public and private, right? It's this weird blend of public internet, of public infrastructure, depending upon the country, and private infrastructure. There's all these parts to it. There's the backbone, which is critical infrastructure. There's a last mile. There's a Wi-Fi point. Maybe there's mobile devices that attach to it, which kind of belong to the citizen, but they also might kind of belong to the corporation. Who owns what where? Who has access where? The challenge that we have is that, by and large, all of us probably want to be able to go online to get services from corporations and government. Today I logged on to City of Buenos Aires' government website, and I saw I could create an account using Facebook or Google, or another option, using something called OpenID, which is an interesting approach to identity, as opposed to India's approach, which is to use biometrics, this thing called Aadhaar, one of the most ambitious technology projects in human history, where they're trying to give every citizen, all 1.3 billion people in India, their own unique identifier, 12-number identifier, tied to a fingerprint and an iris scan, right? And they're doing it because these people were non-existent in the government's eyes before. So social injustice was coming out of that. They couldn't get to services. They couldn't get benefits. The poor people couldn't access things. They didn't exist around schools. I mean, this is a problem, right? But at the same time, we also know this creates a database of people. And we know the history of creating databases of people. Those can be used badly. The earliest uses of the Herman Hollerith punch card, of course, something that led to the creation of IBM. Well, that was used in World War II against a given population. Once a database is collected, it can be misused. We're having a very difficult conversation in my country right now about voter identification laws, saying you have to have this very good voter ID. The problem is that poor people can't afford them or don't have the right documentation. It's much, much harder for them to get a card, and there's systematic disenfranchisement of poor people. And unfortunately, because of the history of my country, there's a correlation between race and poverty. So people who should have more of a voice in politics aren't getting it. and students. A problem for young people too. So what do? Do we say that everything should be anonymous? Do we say that everything should be really who you are? Mark Zuckerberg said everything should be who you are. You should have one identity. And all of a sudden, wait a second, now there are anonymous rooms, and you can maybe possibly log onto a Facebook anonymously because he's changed a little bit since he was a younger guy. He's matured a little bit in the 10 years Facebook has existed, and he sees that there may be reasons to protect some anonymity, some pseudonymity online based upon what you want to do. Right. So let me finish this. I want to finish this one. I think this is an important question that gets to this. We want to be able to be ourselves online sometimes to get essential services, to pay our taxes, to get our court records, to get our credit records, to re-register to vote. We want to have really strong authentication so no one else can impersonate us. And it's going to look like a card and a sensor and a scanner, and like there's going to be multi-factors that identify us when we go through those really secure processes when the government has to make sure it really knows who you are. And there'll be other times when maybe you just want a pseudonym on Twitter, or you want to be super anonymous to leak information to a journalist because you work at an intelligence agency and need not to be traced. Both of these use cases need to exist. We can't say absolutely that they should never one way or the other. And any government that says they shouldn't both exist is one you should be very careful around. And I'll tell you, the ones that have absolute security, absolute identity, I'd say that looks more like North Korea. I wouldn't want to live there. You have a question?
Yeah, regarding the report,
Yeah.
one of the predictions was with our future of data journalism was regarding the shutdown of government agencies last year, that information, public information was
Yep.
lost.
Yep.
People was hesitant to gather it.
Yep.
So, there is a role for universities and libraries.
Yep.
In all this public data, open data, universe, culture, and journalism. So if you can express more
Explain more of that? Yeah.
about that. So because there are maybe NGOs, transparency bureaus, university libraries, and
So-
public data, how
One of the things that I really liked about what Steve Doig said yesterday was that public data is ours, right? This is a really important concept if you're talking with agencies as a data journalist and say, this isn't your data, it's our data. You're in charge of protecting it. We want you to protect it. You're in charge of making sure it doesn't get lost, like emails magically disappear. You're supposed to back it up. You're in charge of making sure that there aren't quality problems with it, where someone's expense report magically disappears, where someone's vote wasn't recorded. Your job is to keep it for us, to be a steward of it for us, to keep it for history. And maybe we accept there's some kinds of data which shouldn't come out during an administration. We had a president who recorded his conversations. Even the ones where he was committing a criminal conspiracy, he recorded. But he did. His secretary magically deleted 18 minutes of it, though, right? Data is the same thing. Any of these records, the things we think about as being documents, forms, tapes, communications, this is all represented in data. It can all be reduced to zeros and ones, to machine code. So it's all something that's part of the record. And in countries where we agree that the record is the public's, then we should have a discussion about when it should be accessible and when. For data that has already been released into part of the commons, for data that we think we should have access to because we've agreed that it's now public, say the census data, right? Our history of how many of us exist and where and what the demographics are. Now we have a question about who's in charge of keeping that, who's in charge of entrusting it to one another, right? And unfortunately, sometimes governments screw up. Journalists always notice that, right? It's our job. So then the question is, where does the data sit? Where does it, reside? Well, one answer in this country is La Nación, right? What happens if La Nación's publisher changes? Or the government decides that we're going to block them, or we're going to slow traffic going into their website, or we're going to just mangle their data so you can't trust it, to be really sneaky, right? Really sneaky governments go change the data so you can't trust it anymore, even though you thought it could before. It's going to happen if it hasn't already happened. Cynicism is sometimes warranted, right? Who then provides that? My best bet is libraries and universities, because they have been, through our history as humans, the places where knowledge resides. And we know the chain, right? We all know that you start with data, you clean it up, that makes information, that can be created equally, transferred to be knowledge. And if you're really lucky, you get wisdom from that, which is the most precious thing, right? Wisdom is the thing you get at the end of that chain, and if you have it at the right time, it changes the world. It's ideally the thing your grandparents tell you. They say, I lived this life, I made these mistakes, here's some wisdom. So who's entrusted with knowledge in our societies? Who's entrusted with information? Universities and libraries. If there's anyone that we want to see be the repositories for data commons when the things get shut down, it's them. And we know that the librarians will fight to protect their users, their readers. One of the most patriotic things we saw in my country after the Patriot Act was librarians say, no, we're not going to turn over our records to you agents who want to come and see what people are reading. We think people should be able to read our books without you getting to see which books they're checking out and reading. That there's a private right to be able to explore, to learn, without being tracked. This is under some threat, right? Because if you get all our books from Amazon or from Google, now that all is tracked. And we get into some weird places too, where Amazon actually can take away a book from people's devices. That's happened. Yeah. Ironic. Yeah. So there are some real questions about when we digitize all information, who has control over it and where, who accesses it where. And librarians are a pretty good bet to trust on this. But when the data goes down, the government website goes down, access gets shut off, it gets turned down to be worse, the universities and the libraries will still endure. Now, if your universities and libraries come under threat and people don't get upset, then you know you have a societal problem. Right? That's a bigger issue. Ultimately, we have to trust someone to hold our knowledge for us. They're the ones who've done it, so let's stick with that. And data, that's a good place to begin. I'd like for libraries to be a place where any average citizen can go and get what he asked for. How can I find data about this thing in this time in this country? And the librarian will help them find it. It's the one thing that librarians really need to be good at now, because otherwise, we all see in a All right. Okay. Hey. Wow, that's exciting. Okay, more questions? Got to be more questions. Okay. What? Choose your best question.
many problems among the students that participate in US universities because they are tracked. And clearly they are in disadvantage vis-a-vis the US laws. And the universities are interested in knowing what the students do because there's a business around all that. So I wanted to know what you know about that problem in universities.
So we're entering this is definitely no longer about data journalism, huh? I'm going to answer this question quickly.
I did this question because you said that in universities and in libraries should be the data.
Sure. So one way we address this issue of tracking is to create terminals where people can search without being logged, right? To say that in a library, you can go on, you can choose a pseudonym, and you can browse. That you can have access to the data store without being tracked. That's one way we could address this concern about being tracked. One of the challenges we see in the space around online education, though, is the movement towards MOOCs, massive online courses. We did one in data journalism. Stephen and Simon were both constructors. The challenge is that the MOOCs collect a lot of data. But that's the opportunity too, right? They can tell their instructors when people stop watching. They can tell the instructors how many of the 10,000 students didn't understand how this question was phrased. They can tell them at what point in the lesson plan they lost attention, lost engagement, right? It's an opportunity for the teachers to get better at being teachers. But then the challenge is, how do we have that not be used against the students? I have no good answers for this one. I know that I'm watching it very carefully. I'm already seeing lots of real upset in the States and Europe and other countries where they're aware of it. It's usually the elites in other countries because they're reading media that they're telling them to be concerned. Go journalists. Because they really care about their children. There are some things I see as I travel around the world which always unite humans. We love to eat. We love our pets. Man, there's a lot of dogs in Buenos Aires. And we really care about our kids. And so if there are questions about how they're being tracked, how the data about their schooling is being shared or sold, it really upsets parents in a way that it doesn't upset them when it's their own data. It's one of the big levers we have to have discussions about data use. So the short answer is that libraries and research institutes need to have some thoughtful discussions with their users, their citizens, about how their egress and access is monitored and used, and what conditions they want for it. And if they're seen to abuse that, then there need to be consequences. Another question? Mommy?
Journalism, please.
I think, especially in countries that have higher rates of corruption, we should, as journalism, put more focus in transparency, the judicial power. Sometimes it's, we think it's the more obscure in terms of we don't have a law that opens that data. We think in transparency in terms of open data, of course. And also because when you speak the language barriers with the judicial people or law people, that it's very difficult to understand the terms and everything. But do you know any initiatives that are tracking transparent, putting more transparent all the workflow in justice, or putting focus like we do in legislators or in the executive power, focus on judicial power to put them up into the light?
I can't think of one off the top of my head. I can tell you some things that are happening around that which are interesting. The thing to always look for, I think, as a journalist trying to cover the courts, is what systems the courts use to track themselves. They have a docket. To look for the systems the prosecutors use to search for records, how that's maintained, what the access is, and then to advocate to get access to that. Usually there are court records as decisions that are put online these days. That happens more and more. Supreme courts, state courts put those decisions online. One of the useful things that can be done is to monitor changes to the decisions. Many times you see the courts will change the decision, so you can track changes like it's a wiki. It's good data to pull off and scrape, incidentally, right? The challenge is that there is an existing powerful industry around the codes, the standards that come from these places, that's completely focused upon creating a business model for lawyers and for business people to access these things. One of the most important information activists in the world is Carl Malamud. I don't know if you've come across Carl Malamud's work. Fascinating man. He, more than anyone else, is responsible for the data from our Security and Exchange Commission going onto the internet. Single man. There's one of the most important things that he did was to basically buy a bunch of data, put it on the internet 2 decades ago, and then say the SEC you should do it too, and they wouldn't do it. He said, we don't think there's demand. So we took it off the internet and said, if you want this, let them know. And it turned out there were many, 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 many people who'd wanted that data. He's trying to do the same thing with IRS data now, nonprofit tax filings, gigantic industry, lots of money, lots of corruption. And he's also tried to do this with codes from around the world. And he's doing it under the idea that the law itself is the people's. It's a principle. Not a technology issue, it's a principle. So if you look at what Carl Malamud is doing, I think it's an example of what you're going after here, where he's buying codes and he's saying, you can't copyright the law. You can't copyright the rules. I'm going to put them online and you can sue me, but I've got good lawyers. And then that law is being made into code. The code is being made into code, right? But what's interesting is that when you do that, when you make a city's municipal code computable, you can start to do things with it. You can start to see patterns, like Steve talks about, and trends and changes, maybe correlate those changes. And you can also enable applications to be built on top of it, which lets you see if a given choice is useful or not. And this is the service journalism side, this other thing, right? The idea that you can make the city computable, and then you can build in a certain place or not. That's one direction. Another is this Pacer and Recap project. In the States, we have this system where you basically have to pay to get access to court records. And information activists have been paying or encouraging anyone who does pay to contribute the record they get into an open system, which over time has gotten millions and millions and millions of records, right? Under the idea that the law is the people's, it should be open and free. And that's a much safer, by the way, decision than putting research articles online, which are much trickier proprietary issues. The law, usually safer. So there are things. Aaron, yes. Aaron, yeah, Aaron Schwartz. Aaron was actually involved in this Recap project. He was involved in Creative Commons. The act which brought him to the attention of the Justice Department and ultimately led to his prosecution and then his suicide was downloading millions of research papers using the MIT network. Everyone who knew him expected him to look for trends in those papers, not to put them online. But because he'd written this manifesto about putting information online The Justice Department prosecuted him under the full weight of the law, and he just couldn't take the idea of being a felon, and he committed suicide.
Can I ask you something about that? It's about copyright and how that is affecting, documents that should be available.
Yeah.
Journalists think
Yeah.
should be available documents, laws, as you said before, maybe videos. Is there any progress about, because I'm just talking copyright and stopping people to do that? Or is it going the other way around?
It depends on which country we're talking about. It's really ugly, right? One of the things that you see is the use of copyright being used to take down journalism sometimes, right? Sometimes we have various forms of libel and slander laws which are used to take down journalism people don't like. There are, if there is a powerful entity in society which you write about, even if you got them dead to rights, they'll use whatever laws are available to get you. Copyright's a real challenge. And I'm not going to, apologize for something someone else does on that, but I can see it going in very bad directions because of our various trade entities that are negotiating for tough copyright. And there's a real challenge here because of how technology has shifted and also the attitudes of young people. Many people under 30 have an expectation that things should just be free online, including games and movies and TV shows and music. The challenge is that someone else spent time and money to make the thing, and how do you help them be compensated? This is a problem for journalism too. Really good investigative journalism takes a lot of work and time and money. So how do we talk about whether it should be behind a paywall or not? Whether it should only be available to subscribers or available to everyone? I do think that there are really good reasons to be suspicious of a lot of the arguments from the entertainment industries around copyright. I also like the idea of protecting a journalist's right to be paid for his or her work as well. So.
We're done.
Ah.
That's about news. But the good news is lunch is ready. And that Alex will be around a couple of more minutes, so if you want to make him another question.
Okay. I hope this was better than me giving you a presentation.